A lot of people just try to eat less calories, right? They're like, I'll just, cut my portions down. I'm eating the same stuff I was eating before, but I'm going to just eat half as much. Instant fail due to hunger. Like everyone's eating to satiety. You're already eating to satiety of the food you're eating now. So if you just try to cut everything in half, you're going to be starving out of your mind immediately. So just like portion size, or I'm going to eat less of the same stuff, is an epic fail.
Hello, my Betties, and welcome back to another episode of Better with Dr. Stephanie. It's me, your host, Dr. Stephanie Estima. And today I have a very special guest. I interview Dr. Ted Naiman, and we are talking all about protein, satiety, and hedonic eating. Dr. Naiman is a board-certified family medicine physician in the Department of Primary Care at a leading major medical center in Seattle. And his personal research and medical practice are focused on the practical implementation of diet and exercise for health optimization. And he's also the author of the PE diet. So what did we talk about today? Well, we actually went macro by macro through protein, carbohydrates, and fat in terms of optimal consumption. We often talk about the caveat for perimenopausal women. So we talk about protein, we talk about carbohydrates, we talk about fat, we talk about fiber, we talk about non-nutritive sweeteners. Oh, you're going to want to wait until you hear about his opinion on aspartame. I cannot wait for you to hear the entire conversation. I found it incredibly useful, and it is going to definitely change some of the ways that I am implementing proteins, fats, and carbs in my own life. And I know that it's going to do the same for you. So please enjoy my conversation with Dr. Ted Naiman. All right, Dr. Ted, we are going to jump right in. And I want you to maybe outline for us, with your breadth of clinical practice and experience working with patients, what are some of the most common mistakes that you see when someone is entering a fat loss stage, or they're trying to reduce their adipose tissue?
Gotcha. Okay, well, first of all, a lot of people just try to eat less calories, right? They're like, I'll just, cut my portions down. I'm eating the same stuff I was eating before, but I'm going to just eat half as much. Instant fail due to hunger. Like everyone's eating to satiety. You're already eating to satiety of the food you're eating now. So if you just try to cut everything in half, you're going to be starving out of your mind immediately. So just like portion size, or I'm going to eat less of the same stuff, is an epic fail. I've also found that when people cut back on their calories, basically everybody's eating until they get enough protein. So if you cut back on your calories and you're cutting back on your protein grams at the same time, again, you're going to be hungry. So you can't just cut back on calories. You have to cut back on carbs and fats specifically and keep all the protein there. You know what I mean? So you have to eat just as much protein as you were eating before. You have to have the same level of satiety that you had before. And so you really have to focus on what you're eating instead of how much you're eating. And that's probably the biggest fail that I see. There's a bunch of other ones though. Intermittent fasting. So like people they'll be like, oh, well, I'll just go a super long time without eating. That's great, but that has an expiration date. And then you're starving out of your mind, and you still haven't learned what you should eat when you're eating. And you're going to be so hungry that you might just eat a whole jar of peanut butter. And then you're right back to where you started. So people will just gain and lose and gain and lose and gain and lose the same 5 pounds over and over again by trying to over leverage intermittent fasting. Intermittent fasting can be a tiny bit beneficial layered on top of already knowing what to eat. But if you just have a monofocal over reliance on intermittent fasting, that's going to be an instant fail. Yeah, but those are some of the bigger ones that I can think of.
Yeah, and I think that this warrants diving a little bit into the protein leverage hypothesis. I think what you just said there sort of alluded to it. When people just cut their calories in half, they're going to be cutting everything by half, or even if it's just 20% or 30%, you're going to reduce everything, including your protein, by 20 or 30%, which is going to necessitate, you're going to continue to search for those calories. So just take a moment for my listeners who are not familiar with that to explain what the protein leverage hypothesis is and why what you just said, which is cutting back on all calories, total calories, is not a great idea when we're thinking about fat loss.
Gotcha. So this whole protein leverage thing was discovered by Professors Raubenheimer and Simpson down in Australia. And these guys, I tried to give them the Nobel Prize for this discovery, but Turns out I can't give out Nobel Prizes, so
You can
that
send
didn't
them a
happen.
lovely note. Yeah.
Exactly. They emotionally, I'm giving them a Nobel Prize for this. They realize that across all animal species, there's this protein leverage phenomenon where animals will eat until they get enough protein, and this is conserved from like insects up to birds and fish and mammals and humans, of course, because we're just like giant animals that talk. So pretty much you're eating until you get enough protein, and only then are you going to stop eating. And protein dilution, when you dump a bunch of refined carbs and refined fats into the food supply, you end up eating the same amount of protein, but you have to overeat carbs and fats to get there. It's like your grandparents just killed a chicken and ate the whole thing, but you go through the drive-through and get chicken nuggets, and in order to get the same amount of protein from chicken nuggets that you got from chicken, you have to massively overeat 1 trillion calories from breading and oil and all these refined carbs and refined fats that were added. And that's how protein leverage works. You're going to eat until you get enough protein. So you can either just eat that chicken and be done, or basically just be eating your body weight in chicken nuggets all day long. And
Right.
that's protein leverage, in a nutshell.
And I think it's very useful for my audience, typically perimenopausal and menopausal women, like somewhere between 35 and 55 years of age, trying to figure out why their body composition is changing despite doing the same things that they've always done. They're accumulating more of that ectopic fat distribution centrally. Maybe they're seeing changes in muscle mass, changes in strength, changes in power, despite doing the same thing that they've always done. So I think that this is an important point when we're trying to, from a nutritional perspective, think about what are some of the ways that we want to accelerate or optimize fat loss, not just weight loss, but fat loss. It's to have it, to pull protein out of the, let's say, total percentage of total percentage of calories that you're eating per day, and make it a gram target. So irrespective of the calories that you're eating, whether it's 1,800 calories, 1,500 calories, whatever 100 calories, there's still a protein target that is being reached irrespective of total calories. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. Right. That's exactly how it works. You're going to eat a certain amount of protein. So if you go out of your way to target that first and eat higher protein percentage foods, you're basically just going to eat less downstream calories. And so protein awareness, protein prioritization, really, really important. Most people are blissfully unaware that any of this is even remotely going on. So yeah, it's kind of a big deal. I agree.
It's kind of a big deal. Yeah. And to your point around intermittent fasting, this is an area where I've changed my mind on. So I used to write a lot and talk a lot about intermittent fasting for women and doing it aggressively so. And now as a woman myself in perimenopause, and I'd love for you to speak to, my original question was common fat loss mistakes. I would like us to sort of break out that category of perimenopausal and menopausal women, because as a natural function of aging, we are naturally more and more catabolic. We might be lifting all the weights, but we just are, that catabolism, whether it's osteoclasts, whether it's net muscle protein synthesis, it's harder to get ahead of it as we age. And so this intermittent fasting, this idea that you might fast until noon or 1 o'clock. Or I know that there are a lot of individuals online who talk about like OMAD, like one meal a day or 24-hour fasts as a gut reset, as a hormone reset, whatever. This is where I now disagree with that for women. I think that if you are going to fast, it should, at least my opinion, and feel free to redirect me or tell me what your thoughts are on this, is you can still fast. Like we all fast every day, we're all sleeping, but it should be much gentler. It should be sort of a intermittent fasting light. And I would much prefer you to have almost like a phasic shift where you're eating earlier in the day, like you're eating upon waking. So you're sort of breaking that, catabolism that's happening overnight to the muscle tissue. And then maybe if you want to fast for a longer period of time, like you cut off your evening calories as you're going into sleep.
Right. Absolutely. So like the concept of this U-shaped curve with intermittent fasting, where, just eating every second of your entire day would probably be a little too frequent. But then, let's be absurd and say I'm only going to eat once a week, once a month, once a year. You can kind of see that it's obvious that there's a U-shaped curve with a sweet spot for eating frequency, and such a thing as too frequent and not frequent enough. So I like a light intermittent fast. I think by the time you've shrunk all the way down to one meal a day, you've gone past optimal and you're sliding into suboptimal. So I like just a sort of a light 16-8 for most people. If I just had to prescribe one regimen to the whole planet, just, in general, it would be a 16-8, which is just a light intermittent fast where you're fasting just enough to get really in touch with hunger and fullness, and you're cutting down on snacking, and you're kind of partitioning your day into eating and not eating a little bit, but you're not just shrinking it all the way down to one meal a day and
Yeah.
getting overly hungry, overly catabolic, and that sort of thing. So yeah, intermittent fasting, lightly beneficial, but only to a certain point. It doesn't scale. You can't leverage it harder, and you just layer that on top of already knowing what to eat and eating the right things. It's something that nobody has to do. Anyone who's successful with their diet could take what they're eating and break it into 10 meals and eat it throughout their waking day and not intermittent fast at all. And if they're eating the exact same foods, they're going to have the exact same outcome, basically. So it's nothing that anyone has to do, but I do find it lightly beneficial when people are just eating to satiety, like most of us are, because you get a little more in touch with hunger and fullness. You get a little more fat adapted. You get a little better at operating without having to constantly refuel your liver glycogen by just grazing on snackable carbs all day long, if you know what I mean.
Right.
So there's some benefits there. They're, not essential. I think they're valuable a little bit, but you really want to pitch it right in the middle of this U-shaped curve, which is going to be, 2 or 3 meals a day, a 16-8, that kind of thing.
So let's go back to a comment that you made with intermittent fasting. You said, intermittent fasting doesn't teach you what to eat. It just sort of limits how much you can eat, right? So it's more of a caloric limiter. Let's talk a little bit about what we should be eating. And maybe we'll start off with satiety. First, what satiety means, but then how can we upregulate through our food? How can we upregulate satiety signals? Let's start there. Let's start with those two questions.
Gotcha. So satiety is just the opposite of hunger. You're full, basically. And satiety is important because pretty much every single human and animal on Earth just eats until they're full and then they stop eating. That's basically how it works. Unless you're starving and then you eat because you don't have any food. But most humans and animals are eating until they feel full. And your brain doesn't really know how much you've eaten. It's guessing, right? So it takes maybe hours for all the food you ate to be digested and enter your bloodstream and end up wherever it's going to go. And by then it's too late. You have to stop eating at some point, and your brain has to guess when you've eaten enough. And your brain does that thanks to, millions of years of evolution, where you can kind of sense what you're eating by chewing and swallowing and weight and volume in your stomach and weight and volume in your gastrointestinal tract and the foods that have been in your environment before, the things you've eaten before and what ended up happening downstream. You're kind of guessing, okay, I think I ate enough. I think I'm full. But it is just a guess. And it's very heavily influenced by protein percent, by energy density, by how tasty things are, and hedonics and flavor combinations. And we've pretty much broken the system by just sucking all the calories out of foods with refined carbs and refined fats, basically sugar and oil, and then making these ultra tasty, ultra hedonic, high sugar, salt, fat, combinations that where you're full, but you still eat more because it's so hedonic and tasty and delicious and dopamine spiking and addictive and all that sort of thing. So now you're looking at a scenario where just eating to satiety isn't going to work when the foods in your environment are super low in protein, super high energy density, way overpacked with carbs and fats, and then so delicious that you're going to overeat just because you're addicted to the dopamine spike you get from Oreos. So that's what satiety is, and that's kind of how we've broken it with the modern food supply. And that's kind of why you need to worry about the satiety per calorie of the foods that you're choosing, and food choice becomes a super big deal.
And so if we are thinking about prioritizing protein and we're pulling the protein out of the percentage, we're making it a gram target, what is a reasonable protein target that we want to be thinking about? And we've all heard the 1 gram per pound of ideal body weight as a starting point. I want to put a little caveat here and say the cohort that I want you to speak to is these perimenopausal and menopausal women who, like me, grew up in the high carb, low fat, count 10 grapes and 2 almonds as your snack kind of, it's like 2 meals and a sensible shake. And what was that? Oh, it was 2 meals and a sensible shake at night.
Right.
What was that called?
I remember that commercial for Slim Fast or something.
Slim Fast, that was it. Slim Fast. So we have all of this conditioning from, growing up in the 80s and the 90s, et cetera. So what would be an appropriate protein gram target for a perimenopausal and menopausal woman who, as we know, we're seeing some of these metabolic shifts in her. We're seeing these sex hormone, these anabolic hormones decline, or maybe we're seeing, that fat distribution change in her as well.
Right. So basically every single client you have, they don't want weight loss, they want fat loss. And they basically want body recomposition, higher lean mass, which is bone and muscle and function and looking good, and fat loss at the same time. So you want more lean mass and less fat mass. That's basically more protein and less carbs and fats. And so you can kind of look at your diet from like a protein to energy standpoint, where you want more protein and less non-protein energy. But the protein target is based on, you can't base it on what you weigh, because you might be like 10,000 million pounds overweight. So you have to base it on how much you should weigh, basically ideal body weight. I like to calculate that using height. So you should basically eat a gram per pound of ideal body weight based on your height, like what you would weigh if you were completely ripped and jacked and totally at your goal and on a bodybuilding stage. You know what I mean? That is the weight you'd want to use, and it's a gram per pound. It's and of course it doesn't have to be exact, and anywhere from 0.75 grams per pound to 1.25 grams per pound, basically a gram per pound, plus or minus a reasonable amount, would be a really good target. But yes, my favorite, just rough advice, is a gram per pound of absolutely ideal body weight if you were completely perfect proportions based on your height.
And so what if you're consuming north of that? So I'm definitely consuming more than 1 gram per pound of ideal body weight. I'm probably at like maybe 1.3, 1.4, which may or may not be correct, but I feel really good with that. Tell me, is there any, certainly you might have, for some individuals, you might find that there might be some GI distress with too much protein, especially if the bolus, if you have too much in one sitting, let's say. Is there any, we talked about the area under the curve for intermittent fasting. Are you riding the area under the curve by eating more and more protein, or more protein than the 0.75 to 1.25 grams that you just laid out?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's always a too much and too little of everything. Basically, everything in your life is on this U-shaped curve where there's too much and too little. If you eat 0 grams of protein, you're going to die. If you eat a 100% protein, you can't convert it into energy fast enough, and you'll actually die of energy calorie starvation as well. So you can't eat 100% protein and you can't eat 0% protein, and you have to be somewhere in between. But there's a lot of leeway on the higher end. Now, on the low end, it gets scarier and scarier. You will start losing bone, you will start losing muscle, and low protein diets can literally cause sarcopenia, osteopenia, and all sorts of triage problems, because your body just stops growing, hair and nails and things that have protein in them but are not absolutely essential. So you're not going to get into nearly as much trouble on the high end, as long as you don't have some weird genetic problem where you can't basically deaminate a protein fast enough. Then you can really exceed. We have animal studies where we're feeding them 50% of their calories from protein, and they're super lean, super jacked, and super hungry all the time, but they are still alive, and it doesn't seem to be terribly damaging. So you really, most normal healthy people don't really have to worry about quote unquote too much protein. That's basically not even a thing. So no, I would not be worried about that. But you'll find that as you crank the protein percent higher and higher, you're just hungry all the time, because you just can't extract enough energy from it. It's just not efficient enough. And that's why nobody's living higher than about 40% protein for any length of time. I mean, maybe a few perma-lean bodybuilders are higher than that, but it's really hard to crank the protein percent that high for any length of time, because you just get hungry.
Yeah. And I wanted to bring up the bodybuilder example because I think that there's a lot, irrespective, you could be talking about bikini competitors, wellness competitors, figure competitors for women, and then of course the physique competitors for men. I think that there's a lot that we can learn in terms of body recomping, well, leading up to a show, and then of course what happens afterwards as they're trying to limit the amount of fat that they gain, as they're coming off of a show as well. I do think that if we sort of look to the general composition of their diet, you're going to find, to your point, that 40%, maybe 50, maybe on the upper end, 50% of their calories are coming from protein, and then kind of whatever else combination of carbohydrates and fat to sort of fill that. And maybe we don't want to get stage lean because there's lots of problems for, we can talk about losing your menstrual cycle and thyroid dysfunction, all that kind of stuff long term, but we can certainly learn something from them even in their off season. They're still consuming 40%, let's say, of their calories are coming from protein. So I think that that's something not to ignore. It's not nothing. What I wanted to ask you about was protein per meal. So I tend to have my biggest protein meal in the morning just because I like to eat before I train. So I'll have sort of a big bolus of some oatmeal and some like whey protein powder. There was a study, and I'm forgetting the authors now. It was just done on men, but the conventional wisdom was your body is not able to make use of anything north of 40 or 50 grams of protein. And there was a study that came out a couple months ago where they had males who, I think they consumed 100 grams of protein, and they were still able to make use of, they thought, the MPS and everything, the muscle protein synthesis would stop after the 50 grams of protein had been, digested or whatever. But they found that at the 100-gram level, that there was still this sort of residual muscle protein synthesis. So in the same vein, you've said that you run into less problems on the upper end of the curve. Do we also see that at the meal level? So if you're aiming for, 30 or 40 grams, but you end up consuming 50 or even north of 50, do we know if there is an upper limit for muscle protein synthesis? Do we know what a good gram target might be generally for a meal that we're consuming?
Right. So protein distribution, again, is on this U-shaped curve where if you're, a boa constrictor and you just swallow one rabbit every month or something, you will it will take so long to traverse your GI tract. You'll slowly bleed aminos into your bloodstream for a much longer period of time.
So much more efficient than humans, isn't it? We have to eat every damn day. I wish I was a snake
it's
sometimes.
Absurd.
Yeah.
But then they get real cold.
Yeah, that's true.
It's the same way with the distribution where you could get by with one giant protein meal a day, and all these things happen. There's this ileal break where the contents of your small intestine slow way down, and you have this giant bolus, and it slowly digests, and you're bleeding amino acids into your bloodstream for a much longer period of time than anybody thought, and you have muscle protein synthesis for a longer period of time than anyone thought, because yes, there was a point where they were like, oh, if you eat more than 30 grams in a meal, you just wasted it. And it's, which it sounds absurd because it is absurd, but then it is on this U-shaped curve where it's not optimal to just have an IV drip of protein with a couple grams every hour, because protein is designed to be a bolus phenomenon, and you're supposed to get this certain amount of leucine to trigger muscle protein synthesis. And so it's good to bolus it and have it at discrete intervals. So you don't want to eat just 5 grams of protein every 5 minutes for 24 hours, but then you also don't want to just eat an entire cow once a year, you know what I mean? So I like more than one protein meal containing meals in a day. I would say a bare minimum would be 2 large protein containing meals, bookending the start and stop of your eating window. And it's important to have that one at the end of your eating window, because then you have more amino acids available, at night when you're asleep and that kind of thing. But it's really, really important to target that first meal of the day. That's the low-hanging fruit. That's where everybody's falling off a cliff. So most Americans are actually eating enough protein for dinner. We're eating enough protein for dinner. We're making it happen. Lunch, not so much. Breakfast is a crime. It's a joke. It's horrible. It's so low in protein. And we have all these studies where if you eat more protein at your first meal of the day, you're going to just literally eat less calories all day long, and you're literally going to be more successful. So the low-hanging fruit that most of my patients need to focus on is that first meal of the day, eating way more protein and getting a lot larger amount of protein. So my advice is a bare minimum of bookending your feeding window with really large bolus of protein, at least 30 to 50 grams, and then throwing some more protein maybe in the middle here and there. But I think it's very important to hit that first meal a day. That's my advice to most people.
And just keeping in thinking about action items for our listeners, what are some of your favorite high protein breakfasts that you might recommend to your patients?
I mean, I absolutely love low carb and low fat fermented dairy. So I'm all over the, any Greek yogurt that's low carb and low fat. Your Oikos 000, your Too Good, your Dan Light and Fit. I'm just eating my body weight in that stuff every day. Absolutely love it. I mean,
and it's
so
cheap,
easy.
and it's so cheap.
It's cheap. It's convenient, and it's ultra processed, by the way. And I literally don't care. So, but that's a whole other rabbit hole.
Right.
But I love cottage cheese.
Well, it's processed. It's not ultra processed. I think when we talk about applesauce is like cooking a steak is technically processing the steak, right? So is yogurt ultra processed, would you say, or would you say it's processed?
Technically, my Oikos 000 with artificial sweeteners and that sort of thing is an ultra processed food.
That's true.
And so that's why I can't just say just only eat unprocessed food and don't eat ultra processed food, because that would be hypocritical of me. But I love any kind of low carb, low fat fermented dairy. Get your Greek yogurt, your cottage cheese, your whey powder, whey shakes, sure, any of those, love it all. It's all good. Also love egg whites, phenomenal breakfast item. I'm making, egg white scrambles, 2 eggs and then a cup of egg whites. Amazing. I'm basically using all kinds of eggs, egg whites, low carb and low fat fermented dairy. And then any kind of lean meat is amazing too. And if you're, vegan, sure, anything legume related, that's soybeans, tofu, edamame, any kind of legume product is okay. I mean, it's not quite as good, but it'll work. Yeah. So these are my favorites.
That's awesome. And soy actually has a pretty good, it's pretty bioavailable. Like when we compare it to sort of other, we'll say vegan sources or vegetarian sources of protein, it has better availability. And I think for a woman my recommendation is always whey protein. I want to ask you a question about whey in a moment. But if there's a perimenopausal woman, maybe we're starting to see that her estrogen is low, and I will add soy back into her diet, and soy protein is a really nice way to do that as well. It's a little mildly, estronergic, and it's also highly bioavailable as well. So for me, it's my favorite sort of vegetarian protein source.
Absolutely, yes. Soy is anything legume is your best option as a plant-based person, with soy at the top of the heap. Absolutely agree.
Absolutely. I heard you talk about how you calculate approximately how much protein is in your food. So if we were to look at that low carb, Danone or the SEAL test or whatever, the 0% low fat yogurt, and you were to look on the nutrition label, there's something that you do to sort of figure out whether or not it's about 40% protein or not. And there's a multiplier there by 10. Can you walk us through what that is? Because I've been using this in even just to evaluate whether our protein bars are actually protein bars or they're just dessert bars. Mm-hmm. Maybe you can walk us through this exercise, because it's really quick. You can do this on the fly anywhere at the airport when you're traveling, and just an audit of your own pantry. So let us know what that is.
Got it. Okay, so anytime you're looking at something with a nutrition label, the two most important factors are protein and then non-protein energy, and the ratio of the two, like how much is protein, how much is non-protein energy. And of course, the easiest way to tell how many, you could count up carbs, subtract fiber, add fat, multiply by 4, multiply by 9. That's going to take forever. Calories is the simplest way to just look at non-protein energy. So if you just look at a ratio of protein to calories, that kind of gives you everything you need to know about how good this food is for your goals, because your goal is to have more lean mass, less fat mass. You want more protein, less non-protein energy. So you look at the label, you want to look at protein and calories. Now, calories is really, really big on the label. That's the biggest number on there. Protein's a little smaller. You have to hunt for it. But, so let's say something has, let's say your yogurt has 20 grams of protein and 200 calories. So you take the protein grams, add a 0 to the end, or multiply it by 10. And if that equals the calories, that's a 40% protein food by calories, which is amazing. If it's higher, it's even higher than that. So if you get the crappy yogurt, the Yoplait original, that's got more sugar than a candy bar and is basically fairly low protein because of everything else in it, that might have 10 grams of protein for 200 calories. You multiply the 10 grams by 10 or add a zero, so you get 100. That's way lower than the calories. You're right. 100 is lower than 200. So you're like, okay, this is not a 40% protein food. It's not quite as good. There may be even worse options, like the candy bar might have 1 gram of protein to 200 calories. But that low carb and low fat, Dannon Light and Fit yogurt or whatever, that has the 20 grams of protein for 200 calories, that's 40% protein, because you multiply 20 by 10, add a zero, that's 200. That equals the 200 calories in there. So you're looking basically at the ratio of protein to calories by just multiplying the protein grams by 10 and seeing if that's equal to or higher than the calories.
I cannot tell you how useful this is. It's been such a game changer for me. My husband was traveling last week and he found these, I think they're Gatorade protein bars, and of course splashed out all over. It's like 20 grams of protein. And I was like, all right, let's take Ted's heuristic here. So it was 20 grams of protein, but the calories were 320. Mm-hmm. So right. You multiply 20 by 10, it's 200. It's less than the total calories. So you know that, and then of course when you look at that, there's like high amounts of fat and then the carbs and all that. So I think it also helps clear up some of the nutrition confusion around label reading. I mean, this was a class that my 13-year-old, like, they're learning how to go through, read nutrition labels, but it doesn't make, and there's no action items there. It's like, here's the calories, here's the total fat, here's the saturated fat. But if you have a multiplier like that, if you say, hey, is my protein calories equal to or greater than, when I multiply it by 10, equal or greater than the total calories, this gives me at least a 40% protein, which is my goal. My goal is 40%, maybe 40 to 50%, let's say, which is so great, because there's even protein bars that are really just like dessert bars. They're just fat, right? And they'll say, oh, here's 20 grams, but it's like the bar is 400 calories.
Right. And the labeling, people figured it out. They're like, oh, there has to be 20 grams protein here. We're going to say on the front, 20 grams protein, but it's 1,000 calories, and it's like 5% protein. And you just realize how brutal that is. So you have to compare the ratio of protein to calories. It's such a big deal.
How about the argument or observation that when you consume something like a whey protein, which I love and I consume every day, that it is insulinergic, that it is going to drive up insulin? Do we care about that? Do we care about the glucose spike that happens in order to drive up the insulin?
Yeah, absolutely not. So first of all, there's really not much of a glucose spike at all from protein. You can eat, as much protein as you want, put on your continuous glucose monitor, and unless you're a type 1 diabetic, you're not going to get a glucose spike from that. Now, it is insulinogenic, but all day long, your pancreas is secreting, more glucagon and less insulin, more insulin and less glucagon. And it has to be perfectly matched on this U-shaped curve. If all of a sudden you never ate anything that raised your insulin, you would absolutely starve to death and die immediately. Insulin's the only thing keeping you alive. Right. So it's a yin and yang. You have to have them both. You have to be anabolic, catabolic, eating food and incorporating it into your body, living off stored calories. So this is constant yin and yang. It needs to be in balance. Just saying, oh, I don't want anything that spikes the insulin part is just extremely dumb, and you'll just absolutely die if you're not spiking.
Well, you would
insulin,
also never exercise. You would never sleep. This is why I take issue with. I don't know what her actual name is, but her handle is the Glucose Goddess on Instagram, and she has a huge following, and she sort of built her platform on this idea that glucose, not to sort of calling one out, but I feel like she's built this entire platform that glucose spikes are bad. Inherently, they're bad. And it's like, well, contextually, like there's always context, right? Like, are you exercising and experiencing a glucose spike? Because that would be a normal physiological response to the exercise. Like, your body's dumping in glucose in order to feed the muscles so that they can perform the squat or whatever it is that you're doing. Same is true when we sleep, right? When cortisol starts to rise sort of midnight, and then that's cortisol's job, is sort of keep blood glucose available for your organs and for you to wake up, essentially. So I find that there's been a demonization of glucose and glucose spikes, and it's like, okay, I get it. If you're a type 2 diabetic and your blood sugar is always high and you're not moving and you're not, there's a lot of the components for a healthy life that aren't there. Of course, we need to be watching that and monitoring it. And I think that everybody wearing a CGM, I don't know. I don't, and I would love you candidly, if you agree or disagree with me, I'm happy to field your opinion and to learn from you, but I don't feel that everybody needs a CGM. I don't think it's necessary.
Not only is it not necessary, but it's actually kind of bad because, okay, let's say you've decided all glucose spikes are bad. Well, diabetes is bad. That's like the going to give you heart disease and kill you. Diabetes is the worst thing ever. It destroys your whole body. Diabetes is just high glucose. That's actually not true, but that's the only way we see it, from externally is high glucose. So you're like, okay, diabetes is bad. High glucose is bad. Anything that raises my glucose is bad. I'm going to wear a CGM and just not eat anything that raises my blood sugar. The problem is as you eat fewer and fewer and fewer carbohydrate, you get a bigger and bigger and bigger glucose spike anytime you happen to eat a carbohydrate, to the point that once you're shrunk all the way down to a pure carnivore diet, zero carbs, you eat just one apple will give you a diabetic level blood sugar. Even if you're lean and healthy and not diabetic, this is just adaptive glucose sparing. Your body is switching over to a ketogenic state where you're preserving any and all glucose for your brain, which is fine, but then you get freaked out of your mind. So it's this weird downward spiral, self-fulfilling prophecy where the more worried you are that carbs are going to spike your glucose, the less carbs you eat, and then the more carbs actually just spike your glucose when you eat them. You can unwind that whole thing in reverse by just going into carbosis, where you just eat absolutely no fat and just massive amount of carbohydrate all the time. You get better and better at handling those carbs, and you get less and less of the glucose spike with the CGM. I'm not saying you should do that, but the point is, like, the nuanced picture is that the answer is somewhere right in the middle. And every issue that's super polarized, where you got people saying one thing and a bunch of people saying the exact other thing, and they all believe it completely, the answer is right down the middle. I mean, everything's like that. Everything you could name, from like politics to whatever, it's all like somewhere in the middle is the right answer. And you want to be nuanced to get the big picture. And wearing a CGM and being more and more afraid of carb spikes is not the answer, because like you pointed out, just doing high intensity exercise is going to give a lot of people a diabetic level glucose transiently, and who cares? I don't care. I think that's great. That
would be a normal response. Like you expect that when you're training or when you're doing a high intensity exercise, that you're sprinting or you're doing whatever. Yeah. So I do really appreciate your comments here, because I think in the online space, it's very easy to talk about nutrition without necessarily a lot of school or background around it. And I think that it's very easy in the social media realm in particular to say very polarizing things that get a lot of attention, because that's actually what the algorithm wants. I mean, you can say, you can talk about, like, politics is another, really great example of that. Medical interventions, like all of these different sort of very polarizing, the more extreme you are, it does seem that the more attention you seem to get. And then that will trickle down into sort of mass confusion for the masses, where I have had women. What I noticed was I was running this ketogenic diet for women, and in the beginning I would see great results. Like, we'd see some water weight dropping, we'd see their motivation levels come up, we'd see some weight come down, and then to your point around riding the area under the curve, they would exhaust the benefits that diet would provide for them, right? So we needed to start increasing their carbohydrates. We needed to pull back on the fat. We needed to increase their protein. And I found so much resistance with these women, because they were so petrified of gaining back water weight or gaining back weight that they had associated with pulling back too hard on the carbohydrates. So maybe let's move into carbs a little bit. We've been talking about protein in terms of protein dosing, protein availability, like when strategically we want to be bookending the day with protein at the beginning of the day, end of the day. Is the same true for carbohydrates? Is there times where we want to be strategic around carbohydrate consumption? And if so, what are the types of carbs that we want to be consuming in that strategic time window?
Absolutely. So basically, all three of your macronutrients lie on this U-shaped curve, where there's absolutely such a thing as an optimal zone in the middle, and then too much or too little on either end. With carbohydrate, let's say I shave my carbs all the way to zero because they're not essential and I can live without them. Well, okay, you can get by, but is that optimal? So your body has cell types that can only burn glucose for fuel, right? Your red blood cells, some cells in the medulla of the kidney and the eyes, and some neurons in your brain. These cells have to have glucose. You will manufacture glucose every day. If you're strictly ketogenic, maybe you only need 50 grams to get by and be alive. But most people are going to need, closer to 100 grams of glucose just to be alive and to keep all these cells going and functioning. Now, if you're eating absolutely no carbohydrate, you have to manufacture that glucose. And to a large extent, you're going to use protein to do that. So you can basically break down protein and perform gluconeogenesis and make glucose out of protein. Well, we've kind of established the fact that most people are just barely getting enough protein to get by.
Right.
And their protein percent's horrible. They're getting sort of a bare minimum. Now, if I suddenly have to use some of that protein for gluconeogenesis to make enough glucose to be alive, then I'm even a little bit further behind on, my absolute grams of protein that are available for anabolism and everything else you need protein for. So I don't know that that's optimal. I think you've slipped past optimal. Now, that's just to be alive walking around. As you do higher and higher intensity exercise, the number of calories you need from glucose just gets higher and higher and higher. So, 80% of your maximum heart rate, you're using a fair amount of glucose. 90%, 100%. As you hit maximum intensity, you're burning 100% pure glucose for energy in your muscles. Now, you can do that for short periods of time because you keep some glycogen in there all the time for survival purposes, but it might take you a whole day to replenish that glycogen,
right?
Just scrounging around for protein or the glycerol backbone of all the fat you're eating, or some little, your body will make it work. Like, that which the body needs to survive, it will find somehow, but it's going to suck. It's going to be, let's just say your elite soccer player is not going to play, a 2-hour game and then just immediately play another 2-hour game in a tournament later that day on their zero carb carnivore diet where they're sprinting 80, 90, 100% of maximum for hours and using a ton of glucose. You physically can't do it, and it's just not quite optimal. So shaving the carbs all the way to zero is not optimal. There are a few other problems with that as well. Fiber gives you a lot of weight and volume to your food, a lot of chewing, a lot of weight and volume in the stomach, a lot of weight and volume in the small intestine, huge boost to satiety per calorie because you're getting a lot of satiety benefits for a very few calories. If my carbs are zero, guess what? My fiber is also zero. So right. I'm leaving money on the table when it comes to satiety per calorie in my diet. The other problem with zero carbs is there are some micronutrients that are more highly represented in carbohydrate. A lot of my zero carb carnivore people tend to be a little bit lower in magnesium, a little bit lower in folate, a little bit lower in thiamine. And you're basically, vitamin C for sure, you start struggling in the micronutrient department as you shave your carbs lower and lower and lower. Yeah. So that's kind of a mistake. So you really don't want to go to zero on any macronutrient, including carbohydrate, even though you can. So it's possible to eat no carbs. It's not optimal to eat no carbs. Now, of course, there's the other end of the spectrum where you don't have any muscle, you're never depleting glycogen from it, but you're just eating, 500 grams of carbs a day, and your liver is totally full of glycogen, your muscles are totally full of glycogen, and then you have to try to turn all of that into fat, and you get a lot more fatty liver, and you get a lot more blood sugars ups and downs, and a lot more carbohydrate dependent, and you get hangry 2 hours after you ate a bunch of carbs because your blood sugar went way up and then came way back down. So there's this over-carbing type phenomenon. You don't want to do that either. You really want to eat, what you want to do is eat enough carbohydrate to supply all your glucose needs for the day without having to burn any protein to do it. And then extra carbohydrate for any high intensity exercise you're doing. I would say about 1 gram per minute for high intensity exercise. So like your average person, I hope they're doing a half an hour of exercise every day. And let's say you need 100 grams of, glucose just to be alive. So that's, 100 grams of carbs. And then maybe you're doing half an hour of high intensity exercise. That's another 30 gram per minute. So now you're eating, roughly 1 gram per pound of ideal body weight. in carbs, like you're trying to keep the ratio of fiber to non-fiber as high as possible to maximize the satiety per calorie. You don't want all those carbs from sugar or flour. You want them from like something with a lot more weight and volume and fiber, like fruit or grains or tubers or something like that. But for the average person who's not a type 1 diabetic or doesn't have to be ketogenic for a seizure disorder or some weird fringe case, I'm really suggesting maybe a gram per pound of ideal body weight in carbs, also just like protein, with the caveat that you're paying attention to fiber and keeping the ratio of fiber to non-fiber carbs as high as possible. That's going to improve the quality of those carbs. Basically, carbohydrate quality is mostly determined by how much fiber is in there, but you're going to get more nutrients, more weight and volume, higher satiety per calorie. So most people, I'm like, okay, you probably want to eat 100 grams of carbs, maybe if you're exercising a gram per pound. And that seems to be a sweet spot. But and that ends up being, 25-30% of your calories. I think it's probably a mistake to go below 25% of your calories in carbohydrate. I mean, you can do it, but it's probably not optimal.
Yeah, and the adherence to it long term, I think, I think anyone can do anything uncomfortable for a short while. We can intermittent fast, we can pull back on carbohydrates, we can, anyone can do anything for a short while. It's the long term game, I think, that we're talking about here. So I agree with you. I think that I had a question for you actually about the carbohydrates and the fiber. So you said you wanted to keep the ratio of fiber to non-fiber really high. So do you have a similar, heuristic or way of, in the same way that you explained to us, multiply protein by 10, if it's, equal to or greater than the total calories, then you're sort of at about 40%. Would you say the same thing is true for the fiber to non-fiber? Are you looking for, is there a certain multiplier or a certain way that you want a certain ratio that you're aiming for with fiber to non-fiber carbohydrates?
Yeah, absolutely. It's like about maybe 5-1, right? So okay, well, let's say I buy some Wonder Bread and I look at the label and it's got, 50 grams of carbs and 1 gram of fiber. So that's like a 50-1 or a 1-50 or however you want to look at it. Yeah. But then let's say I buy the Ezekiel sprouted bread that's like just super unprocessed, whole grain, blah, blah, blah. Maybe it's 25 grams of carbs and 5 grams of fiber. Yeah. And that's this 5-1. And I'm like, oh, okay, that's way better. So that's just a really rough estimate. But yeah, I kind of like that 5-1 ratio of 5 non-fiber carbs to 1 fiber, and that's just like a very rough ratio. But that's another heuristic that I think is helpful. And when you're buying carb foods, look at the ratio of fiber to non-fiber.
The other thing that you mentioned with fiber, which I think is a bit of a lost art in modern world, is mastication, is like the chewing aspect of it. If you're having kale or some type of green leafy vegetable that requires a lot of chewing, often our foods are so soft, not to knock on the cottage cheese that I have waiting for me for lunch today, but that doesn't take a lot of effort, right? And so we see, this is maybe a separate conversation, but we see all these dental issues, all these like sort of faces that are collapsing in. And part of that is because our masseters, and because we're not using our jaws, we're not actually using our muscles of chewing. And I think that there's, unless if our, you have some weird, Kate, where your stomach has teeth, like that's the only place where you're going to mechanically digest your food. And I think that the chewing on your food, I think, is a bit of a lost art. Like we're always like sort of stuffing things in our face anyway, quick little energy bars, smoothies, like everything is already processed. And I think that there's something really important not to forget around slowing down and chewing your food and eating foods that require chewing as well.
Absolutely. Yes. In the scientific literature, it's called oral processing time. And anytime you have a food that has a higher surface hardness and a higher weight and volume and smaller portions, and you have to do more chewing, you're literally going to have a higher satiety per calorie and you're going to eat less, which is why like your air popcorn with just zillions of tiny little kernels, really high volume, you have to chew it a lot. This is a fantastic food. Anything that has a high surface hardness and a low energy density is a win. Carrots, love carrots. Baby carrots, amazing. I eat a ton of these. You have to eat 18 pounds of carrots a day to get enough
Wow.
calories to just be alive in a coma. And it would take you, you'd literally be chewing your whole day to eat 18 pounds of carrots. And so this is a phenomenal food that has a very high oral processing time and very high surface hardness and a very low energy density. And it's like a great snack. Absolutely brilliant. Versus like, your Go-Gurt that you just squeeze in your mouth, or your sports
Right.
gel that you just like, boom, it's gone. Huge difference in satiety per calorie. That is a big deal. Now, of course, like doctors and nutritionists and medical people are so dumb that they're like, well, okay, just make yourself chew every bite 100 times. And we've done studies on this, and people do eat less because they're just absolutely disgusted and revolted. So like
Yeah.
your disgust level goes way up. And that's going to work once for like one meal. And then afterwards, you're going to be like, F that. This is gross and disgusting. So like all these little hacks to like make yourself chew your food more is terrible and awful. You want to do that naturally and organically with food choice, which again, food choice is the single most important factor in all of this. So yeah, I love what you're saying about the surface hardness and the oral processing time, and that's a big deal.
Yeah. And I was laughing before because I recently told a friend that one of my favorite snacks is popcorn, a little bit of like rosemary. I have rosemary on my, little windowsill, and I'll put it in, maybe a little bit of like some sea salt. And she was like, that is just the worst food that you could. I'm like, but it has so much fiber and I'm so full. I mean, granted, there's always a popcorn somewhere. It gets lodged in my teeth and I have to go floss afterwards. But it is one of my favorite foods because of the fiber content and because of how it's that high volume, high satiety that we've been talking about. And it's a way for me to get in more fiber, which I love. It's usually an evening snack for me. I love it.
Absolutely, yes. Air popped popcorn, phenomenal. Love it. Eating it all the time. Definitely great. And so and we have like animal studies where you can take lab animals and feed them pelleted rat chow, and then take another group, take the same rat chow and just pulverize it in a blender and just powderize it, and they will literally just eat more and gain more fat
Right.
from the pulverized processed rat chow. For a bunch of reasons, you have to chew it less. It increases the surface area once it's in your GI tract, so you absorb it even better and even faster. And for all these reasons, it's just not as good to blenderize everything as it is to eat like some real food, that you have to chew. So yeah, love it. Totally with you on that.
And the fiber, just to sort of close this off, women in perimenopause often will complain of cholesterol numbers changing drastically with changing nothing in their routine. Like their cholesterol numbers, particularly their triglyceride numbers, start to go north, which is very scary. And of course, the more fiber that you are consuming, that is going to help control that as well. So that's usually one of the first things that I will counsel someone to do is making sure that they're getting at a very minimum 25 grams of daily fiber, which tracks roughly with your 5-to-1. If we're doing 25 by 5 is about 125-ish grams of protein, or sorry,
Absolutely.
125 grams of carbohydrates, pardon me.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that, that's another, and then the colorectal reducing, risk of colorectal cancer, which is currently the third most common cancer, which is completely unavoidable and silly that it's number 3. And part of that can be, increased fiber intake for our beautiful men and women. Let's move on to fat. So this is another area, again, that I've changed my mind on. I've sort of gone through the cycle of being super keto and being super low carb. And now I'm like, no. Let's talk a little bit about, if we've talked about 1 gram per ideal weight of body weight for protein and approximately the same thing with carbohydrates and the 5-to-1 ratio of the fiber inside that carbohydrate consumption, where does fat fit in? What are we looking for in terms of ratio? And I have a couple questions about satiety of fat as well.
Gotcha. Okay, and so fat is like all the other macronutrients. You have this U-shaped curve. You really don't want to go too low or too high. If you go less than about 25% of your calories in fat, you might miss out on some fat-soluble vitamins. You might get more biliary stasis and increase your gallstone risk. You're not getting this delayed satiation from meals that you might have with a little bit more fat in there. And so there's this sweet spot for fat. Of course, there are essential fatty acids that you can't live without. So if you try to get your fat way too low, you're not going to get enough essential fatty acids and you're basically going to die. So there's this U-shaped curve. As you go higher and higher in fat, it's just not helpful. Fat is not really helping you. It's very passive. It's not helping you do anything. So carbs are ergogenic. You can use carbs for high intensity exercise. They might be a good pre-workout. You could trigger different states in your body. Like if you eat a bunch of carbs right before you go to bed, some people will sleep better because they have this parasympathetic wave, this rest and digest thing. If you have carbs right before a workout, you might actually perform better if you're doing.
Oh, that is undeniable. That is undeniable that when I can say for my N of one, when I have some carbohydrates and some protein, usually in the morning, half an hour to 45 minutes before I'm at the gym, it absolutely affects my performance.
Yep. But fat's not doing any of that crap. It's just very passive. It takes forever to digest it has to, enter your lymphatics and dump out in the thoracic duct, and then your liver does all it takes forever for anything to really happen from it. And then almost all fat, statistically speaking, ends up in your fat cells, where it may or may not be released later based on how much exercise you're doing. So do you really want that to be your dominant macronutrient? I'm going to say no. So again, fat is on this U-shaped curve where you just don't want to be too high or too low. The problem with keto, okay, so everyone was like, keto taught us all that fat is a free food, fat is amazing, eat all the fat you want, and just don't eat carbs. And that works, but the problem is it denies a basic biological reality that humans have a significant appetite for carbohydrate. You have a specific appetite for carbohydrates. You're going to eat carbohydrates. That's why long-term adherence to zero-carb diets is almost non-existent. That's why everyone has this carb creep over time. And I have thousands of patients, and everybody who went keto, immediately lost a bunch of weight from glycogen depletion. They're like, this is I'm just never hungry, and I can eat one meal a day, because fat is such a slow release thing that it's much easier to go really long periods of time without eating, which feels like a superpower. But then you're like, oh, carbs, I'm gonna eat some carbs, right? So you carb creep, but you still have this mindset that fat's fine and free and unlimited. And so then everybody basically loses a bunch of weight right away and then slowly just regains it all from carb creep, and then the feeling that fat's a free food and totally fine. No, fat is actually horrible for satiety per calorie. It's pretty much just as bad as refined fat is just as bad as refined carbs. And so that's why the whole carb versus fat thing is really just a distraction. It's a lateral move to trade off carbs for fat. And you really want some of both. And arguing, okay, 100% of one, 0% of the other is kind of a mistake. And if you look at this U-shaped curve and the polarizing and the answer is somewhere in the middle, you really want to split that right down the middle. I tend to get equal calories from carbs and fat most days. Like, not exactly equal, but roughly the same. I don't most of my macronutrients never go below 25% of calories, rarely ever go above 40% of calories. So you're kind of in this, honestly, 33% from each. Like about a third of calories from each macro is pretty freaking reasonable. That's actually, I'm not trying to go back to the zone or whatever that diet was, but a third of your calories from each macro is pretty good. And going crazy to 100% or 0% of any of them is definitely a mistake because of diminishing returns and because of this concept of a U-shaped curve. And so I like a gram per pound of ideal body weight or higher in protein, roughly a gram per pound of ideal body weight from carbs with a high fiber to non-fiber ratio, and then about a half a gram per pound from fat. That's just rough ballpark for someone who's trying to lose some weight. Is a gram per pound protein, gram per pound carbs, half a gram per pound fat.
For those that are but he just said 33%. Remember that fat has 9 calories per gram. So that's where the 0.5 is coming from, or the point. I would put it slightly lower for body recomp, like 0.4, 0.5, but we're literally talking about the same thing.
Yeah. But it's, and these are going to I think trying to be too exact is probably not going to ever be that helpful.
Yeah.
So just roughly ballpark.
And I like your observation around the satiety because I do agree initially when you are having high fat, you can go hours and hours and hours without eating. And then you're like, oh, okay, it's time for some carbs because I had zero carbs. And then you're comparing the two, then you start pairing them together. This is what I would start to see is like the carbs and the fat together. And then you just, that, you talk a lot about hedonics and sort of the, that's sort of those bliss foods, right? When we see the M&Ms with peanuts, or we see the Doritos chips, it's like fat and carb, fat and carb, fat and carb. And when you start combining those two macronutrients together, it becomes very difficult to manage well, I'll say it this way. It becomes more difficult for you not to overeat. It's more likely that you are going to overeat when you're combining those two things together. And that satiety level that you're talking about, coming back to that original, what we were talking about at the top of the hour, the protein leverage hypothesis, you're still just going to eat until you get a sufficient amount of protein anyway. So you might as well, if you are going to have carbohydrates, pair it with some protein. If you are going to have fat, pair it with some protein.
Right. And so basically what you're doing is you're targeting protein, you're chasing protein, and then you're trying to be a little bit low carb and low fat all the time. And that's kind of, that's the sweet spot, honestly.
What do you think about artificial sweeteners? I know you've talked about a little bit about this before. Do we, and I'll talk about this specifically with baking because I've been experimenting with protein baking and making cottage cheese. Like cottage cheese can basically turn into anything. It can become a cheesecake, it can become tortillas. It's like very versatile. Do you, in the baking, if I'm baking a cake, let's say, and the base is cottage cheese and some yogurt and an egg or whatever it is, are you anti or pro or neutral on non-nutritive sweeteners? And I know that there's a lot of different categories in terms of where they're absorbed, and the aspartame versus allulose, very different. But what is your general position on NNS? And maybe we can dive a little bit into specifics there.
Got it. So for a low calorie food like diet soda, or for a health promoting food that's high in protein and low in carb and low fat, like what you're creating, I absolutely love artificial sweeteners. Love them. Love all of them. Just bring it on. Your
All
aspartame, sucralose, allulose, erythritol. I pretty much like all artificial sweeteners. I mean, obviously, there's some I like a little bit. If you eat like too much sorbitol, you're going to have really bad diarrhea. And, your xylitol is going to kill your dog. But yeah, basically, I like artificial sweeteners a lot. We have all these studies where people trying to lose weight do better on diet soda compared to water because it satisfies this sweet taste that humans naturally have for no calories. It's great. The only setting where I'm less excited is in a highly caloric, like high fat food where you're adding an artificial sweetener and it's just going to be more hedonic and you're going to eat more of it. And that's really your keto cookies and your keto ice cream and your keto snacks. Like you're literally going to eat more that way. So if you have basically a crappy garbage food that sucks for protein, sucks for fiber, sucks for energy density, has a lot of fat, and you're just artificially sweetening it to make it hedonically better, you're probably going to eat more than you would have otherwise. And that's basically all of your keto nonsense. Like, so all of your keto snacks and your keto treats or whatever, that's probably net making it worse. But when you're making your own like high protein, your bikini model style protein treats that you make with your blended cottage cheese and your, whey powder, and there I love artificial sweeteners. It's awesome. You're basically recreating all these foods and for like way less calories and way better macros. So all of your like legendary Pop-Tarts and your Quest bars.
Legendary is the best.
I know. Are they not?
Them. Yes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I have these, basically these bikini competitor clients who are eating, these brownies and Pop-Tarts and things with artificial sweeteners. But because the macros are so good, it's just a win all the way around. They get to have some sort of little dessert and it's still like amazing macros, which is why I'm not that freaked out about ultra processed foods, because if you formulate it right, it's freaking amazing, right? So yes, I absolutely love artificial sweeteners. The only caveat is if you make some really crappy keto brick of like butter and palm oil and then pour a bunch of sweeteners on it. It's actually, you're just getting a little bit more, but it sucked to begin with. So that's kind of like a fringe case. But like all of your like non-calorie beverages or low or no calorie beverages, love it. Amazing. Go crazy. I have patients drinking, dozen Diet Cokes a day. Couldn't care less. Absolutely putting my stamp of approval on there.
So where is the apprehension then around? So I don't hear it so much with allulose. Maybe you hear it a little bit, the erythritol if it kills your dog, let's say. But it's the aspartame, the sucralose. There's another one that I'm forgetting off the top of my head now. But the aspartame and the sucralose, these ones seem to get a very bad rap. Can you explain why that is in the public forum? Is it just misinterpretation of science? What is it?
It's chemophobia. So aspartame, you're basically metabolizing it into two just naturally occurring amino acids that are no problem. And it's one of the most studied chemicals on the planet. We have tons of studies on aspartame. It's basically fine. It's basically harmless. There's really no downsides.
Is there an upper limit? Is there like an area under the curve, would you say, for aspartame as well? Or is there no upper limit?
There is, but the amount it takes to get there would be like several 100,000 diet sodas per day. So You're just not going to run into that under ordinary circumstances. But yes, absolutely, the dose makes the poison. So there's an upper limit to absolutely everything on the planet. Again, U-shaped curve, too much, too little. That's true for oxygen, true for water. It's true for all of your micronutrients. It's basically there's too much and too little of everything. Same thing with aspartame, but the too much would be basically 6 figures of diet sodas per day or higher. So you're probably not going to have to worry about that. Sucralose, it's like a completely novel molecule that didn't exist before, and now there's detectable levels in the ocean, and we're like, what is that going to mean? What are the unintended consequences? And so far we haven't really found any, so it doesn't seem to be a problem. So I'm actually, I have to triage what I worry about in life. There's so many things to worry about. So I have to triage them.
That's so
and
true.
I'm telling you what, those artificial sweeteners are at the absolute very, very bottom. Like the sucralose now being detectable in the oceans, I don't care. I mean, I'm just really, I've got bigger, I'm about to die, right? I'm old. So like I can't
I'm in midlife, y'all. I got to think about that.
I can't be worried about like stuff like that. So I'm focusing on the biggest rocks in the jar, and artificial sweeteners are basically a huge win. And I do have my favorites. Allulose is like brilliant. It's amazing.
I love allulose.
Allulose is the best one. I'm giving it a gold star, but all of them are awesome. I mean, I'm drinking aspartame beverages regularly. I'm not afraid at all. I literally couldn't care less. And
so you're fine if you have a patient who's drinking. You mentioned like a dozen Diet Cokes or something like that a day. You're not concerned with that.
I'm really not. No, that's correct. That's absolutely correct.
That's great. Okay, that's awesome. That's really good to know. And I'm actually interested to see how my listeners hear that, because I think that's the first time that we've really talked about that on the show. I think that generally, and I'm very open to learning more. I've always sort of classified aspartame and sucralose as ones to minimize, and then the allulose, the erythritols, those ones I don't have an issue with them in any capacity. But I have heard people like Lane Norton has talked about aspartame being completely safe, and others. I think I've Alan, I wonder if I spoke about this with Alan Aragon when he was on the show. I can't recall, but yeah, I think it'll be very interesting to see how people react to that, because I think that maybe not conventional, but I think people just assume that aspartame is something that we have to avoid. The Diet Coke is absolutely bad.
And I shouldn't be quite so hyperbolic, because there's always a fringe case where, like, if you're pregnant in your first trimester and you literally have a dozen Diet Cokes a day, that might be 600 milligrams of caffeine, which is going to be slightly higher than recommended for a pregnant woman.
But that's the caffeine, not the aspartame that you're concerned with there. Yeah. Yes,
I just don't want people to at me in the comments and be like,
"Oh, right, okay.
You're killing people."
Okay.
Okay.
I'm going to find some studies, and we'll put that in the show notes as well. Actually, reach out to Lane and see if he can send anything to me as well. Okay. So just as way of example, so I'm always trying to translate these amazing conversations that I have with individuals such as yourself into actionable items. So for you, you're a male about to die, using your own words. What are some of the ways that you implement some of the things that we've talked about? So what does like a typical exercise regime look like for you? How are you dosing the protein and the carbohydrates around your exercise, if at all? Recovery practices, how many Diet Cokes are you having per day?
Got it. Okay, so on the exercise side, there's basically three forms of exercise that absolutely everybody should be doing. The first one is general movement, right? If you're walking less than 7 or 8,000 steps a day, you're basically going to be past the low point of the regulated zone of your diet, right? So there's this, as people do burn more and more calories from exercise, they get better and better and better at matching caloric intake to expenditure, and they get just super, super lean. So all of your endurance athletes just get leaner and leaner and leaner because they're pulling 10,000 calories a day from
And you
their
can
ultra
eat
marathon.
more. Yeah, and you can eat
Right.
more.
But they're eating the exact amount. So there's this like curve where as you do more and more energy expenditure, you get better and better at eating the exact amount, matching intake to expenditure and getting thinner. But then once you go past like lightly active into the sedentary zone, you become dysregulated. Where super sedentary people are eating more calories than someone who's moderately active for no good reason, just because their satiety signaling is broken. So as you get more and more sedentary, you just literally eat more calories for no good reason because you've screwed up your satiety signaling. They've calculated out where this point is, where if you're below that, you're screwed. And it's like a step, it would be an equivalent step count of like 7,150 or something like that. They had like an exact number. It was like 7,000 something step count, which is kind of part of why the 8,000 steps a day is a good goal for most people. Because if you're so sedentary that you're not hitting 8,000 steps a day, you are going to overeat calories and be fatter, full stop, no matter what you're eating. Even if you have good food choices, you're going to eat too much because you're just that sedentary. So anyone who's like super geeked out on their diet, on the diet side, but isn't hitting 8,000 steps a day in exercise, you're totally wasting your time. You know what I mean? You need to focus way more on the exercise side. So there's like this bare minimum exercise that everyone should be doing, but more is better. So the first form of exercise that everybody should be doing is general activity, and that you could just think about step count and walking, and at least 8,000 steps a day. Second form of exercise that everyone should be doing, resistance training. If you don't put maximum intensity into every muscle in your body on a regular basis, your body's not going to have any muscle, because your body is like, why would I bother? Your body's only going to build or hold on to muscle if you communicate to your body that you need it,
that
to
you
be
want
alive.
it there. Yeah.
So at least twice a week, everyone should be doing full body resistance training, push, pull legs, going really hard, taking every set to failure. Every time you do a set, the only reps that actually helped you was the last 2 or 3. And if you never do those last 2 or 3, you're just completely wasting your time, which is why the people in the gym day after day after day with the pink weights never look any stronger or more jacked. So resistance training, very high level of intensity, at least twice a week, full body, push, pull legs, and make sure you're getting to that last 1, 2, 3 reps. Otherwise, you're wasting your time. All the reps in your set are only there to get you to the last 1, 2, or 3 reps, basically. So that's the second form of exercise that everyone should be doing. The third form is some sort of high intensity cardio, and you're doing that in order to get the positive adaptations that you want from cardio. You want a really high VO2 max. You want to be in excellent cardiorespiratory fitness. High VO2 max is more associated with longevity than anything else you can measure in a human. So it's incredibly important. And also being in really good shape is like a freaking superpower. You can just like run up 10 flights of steps and barely even notice. Everyone else around you is like dead. So you want to be good at cardio. You want a high VO2 max. You'll only get that by challenging your body. It's a specific adaptation to impose demand. If you don't impose that demand on your body, it's not going to adapt. So you have to do high-end cardio a couple times a week, resistance to failure a couple times a week, and then just general movement, just like lower intensity, step count, moving around kind of thing. I'm doing all of those, and the volume is pretty low, right? I'm actually not doing huge volumes of exercise, so I don't have to specifically eat for any of those. I'm not doing ultra marathons. I'm not doing huge endurance events. So I don't have to be really strategic with my carbs and my fats and my proteins. I can pretty much just disconnect my exercise from my eating. It's not that big of a deal. The one caveat would be if I'm doing a larger volume of exercise than usual, I might want to time my carbs somewhere around that, either before, during, or after. That's the before is going to basically load you up with glycogen. During might be replenishing glycogen you're burning. And then after kind of helps you with recovery, because the faster you get those carbs back in, you reduce the sympathetic nervous system state, raise parasympathetic, get your heart rate down, all these, recovery type things happen. So basically you might want to cluster your carbs closer to exercise. But unless you're doing a large volume, if you're not working out for more than an hour, you pretty much don't have to worry about timing and tactical anything, you know what I mean? So for myself, because I'm not doing a ton of endurance, I don't have to really sweat the details. So I'm basically just making sure I get adequate amount of protein in the day, bookending my eating window, at least, 2 giant protein boluses before and after, or beginning and end of my eating window, and then maybe some in between to make sure I'm getting adequate. And then fat doesn't matter where you distribute it because it's so passive. Like we said before, just timing is not a factor because it's so slow and passive, and it's not really helping trigger anything in particular. So carbs might be good. I like to either time carbs around exercise or backload my carbs at the end of the day. I like to eat carbs last because it triggers more of a parasympathetic state, rest and digest. I tend to eat way more carbs in the evening, way less in the morning. I like to be more, if I don't eat carbs in the morning, I'm basically in a light ketosis. I've got more sympathetic nervous system, a little bit more wired, you know what I mean? And then like later in the day, I'll eat a bunch of carbs and just like pass out. So I like to use carbs timing strategically, basically end of the day or around exercise. Fat kind of doesn't matter. It just comes along for the ride, very passive.
And before we were recording today, you were telling me about your new app that you have created. I'd love for you to tell me a little bit more about that and what it is, what it does, and if my listeners want to find more about it, where they can go and download it and use it.
Gotcha. Okay, so Dr. Andreas Einfeld of Diet Doctor fame and myself have created this this whole app phenomenon called Hava, H-A-V-A, Hava. You can check it out at hava.co. It's an app that's out now for Apple, Google, whatever. And it's basically, it focuses on satiety per calorie. It's like, okay, there are things that are going to give you higher satiety for the calories you're eating. That's protein and fiber and weight and volume and energy density and hedonics. There are things that are going to make satiety per calorie worse. And that's, higher carbs, higher fat, higher alcohol, higher energy density, more hedonic. And we have this whole scoring system of like 0 to 100, where 0 would be, something that's no protein, no fiber, super tasty and hedonic, super high energy density, like a cookie. A cookie is basically 0. And then 100 is like so high in protein and fiber and water and so low in calories that it's almost unsustainable as well. Like a celery would be 100 and Oreos a 0. And the goal is to be somewhere right in the middle. The standard American diet ends up being about like a 27, 28, 29, upper 20s. You want to get at least to a 50. Basically, as you go up on this scale, you automatically eat less. The whole goal is to eat to satiety, but automatically eat less calories without having to really worry about it or count calories. What the app does is allow you to take pictures of everything you eat. You just take a snapshot of everything you eat, and it gives you it tracks all your macros for you, protein grams, fat. It tracks fiber, protein percent, energy density. It gives you the satiety per calorie of everything you enter, all your meals, all your individual foods, your whole day, over time. And you can see, and it'll tell you, it'll be like, oh, hey, maybe you should add a little bit more protein here and there, or did you know there's a higher fiber version of this, and it's like the goal is to slightly raise your satiety per calorie in a sustainable way without going crazy. So it's like, okay, I could just never eat carbs and be keto, or I could just try to be a little bit low carb and low fat and higher protein and higher fiber all at the same time. And you can make these slight little substitutions and tweaks and just raise the satiety per calorie. And it's little things like, eating the leaner cuts of meat or the lower carb breads, or ratioing things where you're eating a little bit more salad and a little bit less Oreos. And there's no good or bad foods. They're all just on this 0 to 100 spectrum. And the goal is to just eat a little bit more of the good foods, a little bit less of the bad foods in a very sustainable, gradual, reasonable, fashion without going like, okay, now I never eat carbs anymore. I'm carnivore, or, now I'm just doing 100% that or 100% this, or which is basically always going to fail because it's not optimal. You've gone past the optimal zone of whatever lever you were pulling. So the Hub app just helps you pull every lever a little bit, and to get this sustainable, subtle reduction in calories without having to worry about it and still eating to satiety.
I love that. And I love the satiety per calorie and giving a hedonic score on that as well. That's going to be, I'm going to check it out and see for myself as well. And we'll make sure that there's clickable links for that in our show notes as well. Dr. Ted Naiman, this has been such a pleasure. Thank you so much for your time today.
Oh, no, thank you for having me. Great to talk to you.
Thank you.